Welcome to this amazing evening that we have planned for you. My name is Gabriela Sotolaviaga. I'm a professor in the Department of History of Science, and I'm also the Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico here at Harvard University. For those of you who are on Zoom, hay traducción simultánea solo en Zoom. Nada más necesitan bajar y le pican donde se ve el globo ahí para que haya la traducción. For those Spanish impaired, you just need to, if you need translation, Spanish to English, you can just go on your Zoom. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's keynote speaker for the start of what will be a 2-day symposium. When we started planning this symposium, trying to decide who would be our dream keynote speaker, who could capture this moment in U.S. Mexico relations and also the broader social and political landscape, we immediately decided that it had to be a journalist. We wanted to highlight the importance of truth-seeking and storytelling, but also bring attention to the ongoing attacks and defunding of investigative journalism and the vital importance of a well-funded independent media. There was one person who met all of our criteria. Maria Hinojosa is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, professor, and the founder of Futuro Media Group. She has been telling us stories about ourselves, our society, for nearly 40 years. As the first Latina hired at NPR in 1985, Hinojosa has helped to redefine mainstream media, making sure that a diversity of voices gave us a fuller picture of American society. In so doing, she also redefined what constituted American storytelling. She is described by many in the media as fearless, and indeed, her storytelling often makes you gasp, wondering aloud how she was able to find a source and get them to speak so openly with such authenticity. She is the anchor and executive producer of Latino USA, the Peabody Award-winning radio program distributed by PRX and co-host of In the Thick, Futuro Media's acclaimed political podcast. In 2022, she earned the Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting for Suave, a groundbreaking podcast about Luis David Suave Gonzalez, sentenced to a life in prison at age 17. It is nearly impossible to highlight in a brief introduction Hinojosa's many contributions to journalism. But her career spans major networks, including PBS, CBS, WNBC, CNN, and NPR, and an entire alphabet of other news networks. Where she made it her trademark to report on communities that had long been overlooked or underreported by the mainstream media. She anchored the Emmy Award-winning talk show Maria Hinojosa, 1-to-1, on WGBH, and in 2011 became the first Latina to anchor a PBS Frontline report called Lost in Detention, an investigation, remember this is 2011, an investigation into immigrant detention centers that sparked national conversations and attention on Capitol Hill. Her path-breaking journalism has earned her numerous prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, 4 Emmy Awards, 2 Robert K. Kennedy Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award, the Ruben Salazar Lifetime Achievement Award, the John Chancellor Award, the Neiman Foundation Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, and the Studs Terkel Community Media Award. In 2024, she was honored with the W.M. Kiplinger Distinguished Contributions to Journalism Award from the National Press Foundation. She has also been recognized by People en Español as one of the 25 most powerful Latina women and was honored with her own day in October by New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Her impact has also been recognized with 7 honorary degrees, celebrating her contributions to journalism and media. She is the author of 4 books, including Once I Was You, a memoir of love and hate in a torn America, a deeply moving and powerful memoir which Gloria Steinem blurbing about it wrote, quote, anyone striving to understand and improve this country should read her story, end quote. As well as a young reader's edition of that book. Hinojosa is not just an acclaimed journalist, she's also a mentor and an educator. She is the distinguished journalist in residence at Barnard College, her alma mater, where she has taught since 2019. When I asked if she would be interested in meeting with students from Latinas Unidas en Raza here at Harvard, she did not hesitate, and actually we just met with them right before her coming to her keynote. Finally, and on a personal note, and I'm sure I speak for many in this room and on Zoom, Maria's was the first Latina's voice I heard on the radio. Not as someone being interviewed, but the source of news and opinions. She would not back down from tough questioning, and her inquiries were equally hard-hitting as she investigated the impact of, for example, new legislation on Latino communities. But with her subjects, often the undocumented, the deported, the workers who toil in and build America, she was deeply respectful of them, of their stories. For many who did not come from the Latino community, Maria was the one who brought the stories of our community into their homes for the first time, and most importantly, in English. At a time when there were few Latina role models in the media, Maria Hinojosa showed many of us what a strong Latina voice should sound like in society, and more important, why it was, and it still is, needed. Please join me in welcoming Maria Hinojosa.
Oh, yeah, okay, I have a mic. Yes, great to see all of you. It's a little scary when you hear all those awards, la verdad. Even I'm like, oh my God. And me da cosa, la verdad, because I never want it to seem like, oh, I could never do all of those things, and she's just, you know, an alien. Oh, I am, as a matter of fact. There's a joke there. It's okay. You can laugh. Relax, everybody. Relax, relax, relax. But I love the fact that more importantly is what I mean to Gabriela, the professor here, first tenured Latina at Harvard, Mexicana, orgullosamente. Mexicana. And I'm here because of Gabriela. So thank you for having me. Honestly, it's really a pleasure to be back. I have a long relationship with Harvard, having been at Shorenstein as a fellow, and my dad, when he first came, actually, was a researcher here at Harvard, which is a perfect segue to my speech, which I'm going to watch, because I know we've got the timing situation, we've got questions coming up afterwards. I've heard we're not going to be kicked out, so that's a good thing if we go a little bit later. And for those of you on Zoom, hi. It's good to have you from the comfort of your pajamas. So, yeah, what a strange time we're living in, right? We have to acknowledge it as I sit and I'm just like, oh my God, I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts. No idea where that is, but I know I'm close to Tufts. And so I know the trauma that the Tufts community is experiencing right now, because I'm a professor at Barnard, which is part of Columbia University, so I'm dealing with my students and the trauma that they're living with right now. And we have to acknowledge it. We're going through a really painful time. And yes, it's scary, but the fear is what got us here, honestly. The fear is what got us here. So all of those awards and everything, of course, I sit there and I say, ¿Y pa qué? ¿Qué sirvió? What was it worth? You know, doing the documentary in 2011 for Frontline, when we uncovered, right, for the whole country to see what was happening in those detention camps. Hola, Alfredo, what's up? Yeah, I gotta come to Harvard to see old buddies. You know, in 2011, we showed that women and men were being sexually assaulted in the detention camps. We showed the conditions, the lack of food, frankly, the psychological torture, the over-medication, the verbal and physical abuse, the solitary, we exposed all of that. Senator Dick Durbin took it to the Senate floor, and that is why ultimately in 2019 it finally went into effect that you can, if you are raped in a detention facility, that you have access to help. Because the reality is, we all know this, that we have been so dehumanized, right? So therefore, whatever happens to somebody not born in this country, because that is the litmus test. It's not, it's somebody not born in this country, which includes Gabriela and myself and many of you. We are dehumanized. So who cares how you treat them? It doesn't matter. And when you go down to it in terms of the detention camps, right, you deport the evidence. So when you assault somebody and you beat them to an inch of their life, the case goes away because you deport that person the next day. If you rape a woman detainee and she ends up pregnant, you deport her. And it's happened. And we know this. And it's a way in which, yet again, our stories are not told because we are just removed and deported. My speech, I'm watching the time. I did write it out. I usually don't write my speeches out. But of course, I could have talked about everything. And so I was like, no, be a little bit more focused. And so forgive me if I'm reading a little bit. I usually don't like to do that, and I'll try not to look at my paper the whole time. But for this speech, I found myself, and I find myself actually talking to my dad, mi papá, el doctor Raúl Hinojosa. And I'm talking to Dad in the spirit world. He left us 10 years ago, next month. Entonces, I'm talking to Dad in the spirit world, which actually, my dad was a medical doctor dedicated to research. He was an absolute nerd, so he did not believe in the spirit world at all. So here's looking at you, papi, because I know he is communicating with me, but he was like, no, una vez que uno se muere, ya y se acaba. Not a religious man. But I'm talking to papi, and I'm like, óyeme, papi, ¿qué te parece? ¿Cómo ves tantas cosas, papi? Were you right, Dad? Were you right? ¿Tenías razón, papi? Because what happened is that in the writing of Once I Was You, I got to ask my dad that question, which we should all be asking of our families, right? How did we get here? What is our arrival story? And so my dad's arrival story, when he actually came for the interview to the University of Chicago, so he had flown in before, but this time he was taking the bus from Mexico to Chicago. And the bus made a pit stop in Texas. And when he got out of the bus, in an advanced, modern, industrial, capitalist society of the United States, where everything is a dream and a possibility and an opportunity in this great democracy, and Dad gets out and he's like, am I colored or am I white? And that story, when Dad told it to me before the Alzheimer's set in, I could tell that from that moment of his arrival here, he was already circumspect about the United States. No le tenía confianza a este país de gabachos y gringos, his words. Okay? I mean, I always speak the truth, so that's the way my dad spoke. And he was circumspect about the United States also for another reason, which goes to another theme here, which is gender. Because, of course, mi papá was realizing that he was raising an American daughter who was going to have certain freedoms. And, of course, mi papá, hay una gran diferencia entre la libertad y el libertinaje. ¿Qué es el libertinaje, papi? Ya, muchas mujeres americanas tienen ese libertinaje. And I was like, what is it? But, of course, American women being free. But that concern of being an independent sexual woman, right, was really secondary to this concern that he didn't know if he had a place here, right? If there was a door for colored people, a door for white people, was there going to be a door for Mexicans? And the fact that he chose, even though que era de tez morena, he chose white because he could pass. And that sense of like getting in under the door and not feeling like he should have been, like an imposter, right? But ultimately, this place is what allowed my dad to make his dream come true, because he was a nerd in Tampico, and he would dream about being a medical doctor dedicated to research. And I'd be like, research de qué, papi? I don't know. I just wanted to research. And ultimately, he ends up helping to create the cochlear implant. He was a genius. But the University of Chicago did not give my father tenure for 25 years, even though he was a genius. And then he had to fight for it. And of course, it was my mother who made him fight for it. And he was also not convinced about the United States, because we lived through, our family lived through and witnessed Nixon, a corrupt president, Watergate, corruption. And so we understood that corruption was not just in Mexico, as we grew up hearing, right? But it was always right here in the United States, right? And of course, you know, many of you know this, right? In Mexico, we have journalists who are on the corruption beat. Like, that is their beat. That is part of what they do in the mainstream media in Mexico. So of course you're going to hear about corruption in Mexico, because you have a corruption beat. Is there a corruption beat that you can think of right offhand in the United States? Right. I mean, ProPublica, right, that has done extraordinary work, especially on the corruption in the Supreme Court. But if you have fewer journalists covering corruption, you have less talking about corruption. Get it? So it's just like, for example, what happened when I was covering the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna. If those of you who are not aware, you should definitely listen to the podcast. It's called USA versus Garcia Luna, and it involves tequila. Because when I heard about the stories about Garcia Luna, I was like, es que no puede ser, I need a tequila. And I don't drink except for tequila. 1 shot a day, keeps the cholesterol away. No kidding, and that's by a Harvard Medical School graduate, Dr. Alfredo Quiñones Hinojosa. So it's no joke about the tequila. Anyway, so Genaro Garcia Luna, in case you don't know, was the top security official in all of Mexico, handling basically all security, prisons, police, FBI, CIA equivalent, etc. He was the right hand of President Calderón, and he was also the right hand for the US. Lots of photographs exist of Garcia Luna with his arm around Obama, I think Jay Johnson, Hillary Clinton. He was the trusted man in Mexico. But with all of that US intelligence, oh, they didn't see it? Oh, okay. They didn't see that Genaro Garcia Luna was working for the Mexican government, was working for the US government. Oh my God, he was working for El Chapo too. Oh gosh, how did we miss that with all of our intelligence? But he was such a trustworthy guy. Really? Really? So during the trial, and I did not cover El Chapo's trial because I don't want to be a part of the narco reporters. So a lot of narco reporters here in the United States, but not corruption reporters. But during the trial, the U.S. prosecutors actually had on the stand one of El Chapo's main men. I can't remember the nickname, whether it's El Conejo or El Lobo or El whatever. They had all these nicknames, of course, because they're Mexican. But anyway, this guy was managing the Mexico City airport at the time. And it was known, the prosecution said, as basically the Mexico City airport was the FedEx for cocaine, the FedEx for heroin. But the way they talked about it was like, so here's the Mexico City airport, all right? All of the corruption that allows for those planes to be filled with tons of drugs. And the plane takes off with all of that corruption that happens in Mexico, right? In the Mexico City airport, and the plane takes off, and it passes over the wall. And when it lands at JFK, oh my God, the drugs just fall out of the plane. and make their way into drug dealers' hands in Queens. Because there's no corruption at JFK. Work with me, people. I'm trying to make, I'm creating a joke here. But, you know, because the only real narcos in the United States are the guy from Ozarks, right? And Walter White. I mean, other than that, like, you know. So in our minds, that is the narrative that our American mainstream media has about corruption, Mexico, drugs, which leads us to where we are, right? Which leads us to the current president. Some may call him President Trump, and others may call him actually Felon 47, which is factual. Think about this, because I might need to remind you, right, that the Border Patrol is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. Also, the largest law enforcement agency with the least amount of oversight. Right, so let's just be reminded that more money, more of our tax dollars is spent in the detention, deportation, industrial complex than all federal law enforcement agencies combined. You heard that right. More money in the deportation, detention quagmire than ATF, than the federal police, than the DHS police, than the FBI, all of it. That's where our money is going. And yes, sin pelos en la lengua, racism is at the core. Anti-Black, anti-Mexican, anti-Muslim, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, because this is not, in fact, a representative democracy. How could you allow for separate bathrooms based on race if we were a representative democracy? But, you know, also, let's remember that this is not the first time that this has happened, right? So when we heard the first audio, and we're waiting for a whistleblower now to give us more audio of those children in the cages with illuminated blankets, children were separated, indigenous children were taken, right? By the ones who landed here without permission or papers. African American enslaved children were taken from their families, right? Japanese American children were taken during separation in what's called the Japanese internment, which was neither Japanese nor an internment. So it's really the unlawful imprisonment of American citizens and those with green cards who were of Japanese descent. If the original sin was slavery, the first sin was genocide. So there has been a continued narrative about fear and difference in this country, right? The first televised refugee crisis was the Vietnamese people. As a little girl, me watching this and allowing esteemed members of our mainstream American journalism to label refugees as boat people. How dare they? How dare they even continue to use the term? That would be labeling the refugees who are trying to get here, who have to sleep on the streets in Mexico, en la calle. We should call them concrete people, right? So in our country here, right, the civil rights era, Black people rising up and allies demanding for equality, but leads us to a modern expression of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was in 2020, 5 years ago, very soon. So the ripping away of our country because of the question of race and racial hatred and racial difference is central. So let me just, before I turn to Mexico, right? Because our country has not dealt with this, and this void of not taking on this issue has allowed for mis and disinformation and for lies to be told about who we are, which leads to the place where we are now, where everybody is confused about what's happening because we're being told that terrible human beings who have done terrible things in our country are now in the process of being removed or deported. The problem is that the journalists who are telling these stories are journalists who have been raised in this country believing and hearing the same narrative over and over again, specifically about Mexicans, Latinos, and immigrants, right? So it's almost like, how can I fault you if you, the people who are now running, the men who are now running our newsrooms, were educated in taking a journalism that talked and used the term illegal immigrant, illegal alien, that saw us in these ways, and only told all of those stories that I did not repeat about how negative we were for this country. So I do run my own newsroom, and I hope all of you follow Futuro Media, listen to us. We're about to launch something really cool, and I hope you join us, because we are independent. But you know, if I was running all the newsrooms, if I was deciding what the headlines would be over the last 50 years, let's just say, around the issue of immigration, I would have headlines like, 10,000 Bangladeshis are set to arrive in Boston. And Boston is preparing with a parade because they know that Bangladeshis are going to change Boston cuisine forever. And so it's a celebration in Boston. Or 15,000 Salvadorans are arriving to Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is so excited because they know that Salvadorans have the best dancing possible. Okay, I'm making that up. That's not true. But okay. Vamos a decir, Salvadoreños will change how cumbia is danced forever in Los Angeles because of their arrival, and Los Angelinos are out of their wits excited. Or Dominicanos are coming into New York, and the way you hear Spanish will forever be transformed, and everyone is going to be so excited because they're going to understand that Latinos are black. And this is going to change and make more complex our understanding of Latinos and Latinas. Wow, is this going to be cool? And then I go one step forward, and I know we're at Harvard, but you know, I like to push the envelope just a little bit here and there because it's like, oh my God, so many immigrant refugees are coming to our country. Guess how many people you're going to be able to fall in love with and have sex with? Oh my God, it's going to be amazing for our country. Imagine if those were the te gustó ese? Yeah. I try to make, es que if I just get up here and talk about everything horrible, y'all are going to cry. So I have to make you laugh because si no nos morimos, right? And it's also true if you can envision that, right? Like if we told the truth about who we are and what immigrants really have brought, like, oh my God, some guy named Dr. Raul Hinojosa is going to come and he's going to help create the cochlear implant. And then I end up having students in my class at Barnard in the Ivy League who have 2 implants and could not hear, were it not for my father. And then for my student with 2 cochlear implants, I learn that when she's tired of the hearing world, what she does is she takes them out. And I was like, whoa, what? And she's like, yeah, I hear nothing. Can you imagine? What a gift. Gracias, papi. And I have to say that, you know, speaking about mi querido Mexico, as I begin to talk about Mexico, it's kind of, you know, an intense moment for me because my mom just turned 89 last week, and so there was a celebration with 50 of our closest family members, Nataquisa, obviously. But also, that happened on Saturday. The party happened on Saturday, and on Monday, mi tío gordo, mi tío Rafael, passed away. And so it's you know, it's our family is losing one of our elders, and my mom is really having a hard time because she's turning 90 next year, and it's like, she es la más chiquita, so the fear of her being the only one of her 5 brothers and sisters that will be around, right? So, about Mexico. So yes, I was politicized in the United States, but I was growing up in the civil rights era. But I was also politicized in Mexico. Politicized because I grew up hearing about corruption. I grew up hearing about Mexico being an anti-democratic society. My cousins, I was like, ay, vienen elecciones, no vas a votar, ¿para quién vas a votar? Because I knew I wasn't an American citizen. Only my dad could vote in the United States. So the whole notion of voting, and my primos would look at me and they'd be like, votar, ¿pa qué? And I remember like, what? They were like, aquí no votamos, las elecciones no significan nada. And I was like, huh? So growing up hearing that, right? Growing up also being exposed to a machista reality, right? In Mexico. Trigger warning, I am a survivor of rape that happened in Mexico. And never told anyone because, of course, I would have been the one to be blamed. Growing up in a country where my cousins, mis primas, did go to university, but they would just hang up their diplomas on the wall and they never practiced. And my cousin who did, Maritere, really was climbing the ladder in corporate Mexico with an American company, but her husband said to her, no, you have to stop doing that because ¿quién me va a cocinar todos los días? And she let him take away her power. She also died a decade ago of breast cancer, and I think actually of a broken heart. For me, my politicization came because of hearing about Tlatelolco in 1968, learning who is Elena Poniatowska, going to Libreria Gandhi and finding her book and just being like, who is this woman? And what happened in Tlatelolco? You know, Mexico and my cousins alerting me that I was beyond just Mexican, I was Latin American. So September 11th, 1973, when there was the coup sponsored by the United States that took down the president Salvador Allende. These were defining factors that led me as a college student then to become an activist around the issue of Central America and the United States intervention in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And all of this led to me, a central part of me defining myself as a feminist. Back then we said third world feminist. Isn't that cool? I don't know, but let's bring it back, okay. My models, the women who inspired me to believe I could become a journalist, were actually Mexican journalists. Blanche Petrich and Guadalupe Iriza Rios, both, I think, retired, my closest friends as journalists. Blanche Petrich winning the National Journalism Award, being the first one to interview Comandante Marcos from SLN, being in Central America, and Blanche is disabled. Walks with a cane, has polio because she got polio when she was younger, always has been my role model of what is possible to achieve. Mexico for me was always there for a place of constant resistance, protest, critique, grassroots, always pushing back. Yes, of course, always fighting amongst themselves. Mexico, it's left politics, understood. But always pushing, protesting, organizing, taking to the streets. It was, for the journalism, un periodismo contestatario. It was a journalism that was taking to task, right, in the words of Elena Poniatowska, my hero, un periodismo de la indignación, a journalism of indignation. And so, as I was writing about this, I was like, my little history, I was like, and who else is a product of this exact generation? Who else has this exact experience, minus the US exposure? Huh, would that be the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum? Exactly. By the way, Claudia ain't no joke, okay? It took us months to get an interview with her, up until the last moment. It was tough, but we did get the interview with her. And she is such a fast thinker. One of my favorite moments in interviewing her, and I mean, politicians, they're politicians. My job is my job, and their job is their job. But you also have to give credit where credit is due. And when you meet somebody who who's whipper-snapper smart, you have to call it out, right? So when I was asking her, we got 7 minutes with her after a public presentation. You know, speakers were going. She was surrounded by fans adoring. This is during the campaign, but we got that interview. And I said to her, we're of the same generation. And she was like, ¿Cuántos años tienes? Like straight up. And I was like, seriously? And she's like, I'm 1 year younger than you. And I'm like, okay, Claudia. All right. And the last question, because we peppered her with questions of which she was very strong. The last question I had, I was like, bueno, Claudia, if you win, will you do the Guinness Boxing Championship in El Zócalo? And if you do, please invite me, because I'm a boxer and I want to be there if you win. And I said, will you be there? Are you a boxer? And she said, no, I'm not a boxer, but I'm a fighter. And I'm like, boom, mic drop, mic drop. So the question is, so which country is more machista? Which country is more machista? Right? Which country does actually have a category in criminology which is femicide? Therefore, which country has a problem with femicide? Which country does not categorize violence against women as femicide? Which country does not have a problem with femicide? That would be the United States. So it's an interesting way when you start reversing the questions, right? When you start looking critically at how we actually learn from the South, which is something that I've always experienced, but which now, in this conversation, the South is teaching the North in the sense of Mexico. I mean, Mexico, frankly, is leaving the United States behind in ways that we could have never imagined, which is why we can never stop imagining change. And that's why that history of activism in Mexico is central, because they didn't give up. The activists didn't, the feministas didn't give up and just say, wow, we live in a really authoritarian, machista country. We're just gonna like, forget it. No, con más ganas. So I don't want to hear about people here with all of this privilege who are like, I'm just not gonna do anything anymore. I'm just gonna fold my hands and just like be upset. No, Mexico being the leader on women's rights, on judicial issues, on human rights? The problem is that the South is also teaching the North in more horrific ways that I never could have imagined either. Right? I just got back from Guatemala, and in Guatemala, there is a policy of negation. I don't really want to talk about this because I'm going to be giving tools to this administration, which is like, that's a great idea what they're doing in Guatemala. Let's do that. Let's just have a policy of negation. In Guatemala, get genocide. What genocide? What are you talking about? No genocide. Politics of negation, and the United States looking to Guatemala to learn how they do that. Or, in the case of El Salvador, right, where I was there the day that the planes arrived, but we as journalists had no access to any of that, right? And the United States is like, yeah, we like that. Dude, how did you make that film about the arrival of removed people? They're not deportees. If deportation happens, you actually have some sort of process. So these are people being forcibly removed. They're not actually deportations. But the US being like, hey, Bukele, we really like the fact that you've got like a Hollywood team managing your PR. And you made a video with sound and dramatic photographs all less than a few hours after it happened. Also, how do you run your prisons like that? Can we do that? That El Salvador would be leading the United States in like, yeah, let's show you how to do a prison country. We'll show you how. So it's true that right now, my draw and the reasons why I'm talking to my dad is because I'm like, óyeme papi, what do you think about the fact that maybe my dream or my kids' dreams, they are proud Dominimex, Dominican Mexican, maybe it's in Mexico for them. Maybe it's in Mexico for me, papi. Óyeme, ¿qué te parece eso, papi? What do you think about that, Dad? What do you think about the full circle moment, right? And as I said to Gabriela, as I was writing this, I was like, so could I move to Mexico and start all over? Could I reinvent myself as, I mean, I've always been a chilanga, but like, could I reinvent myself as a working journalist in Mexico? Why not? Why not? But the truth is, I don't live there, so I do have to couch everything that I'm saying in terms of this appreciation of where Mexico is right now, because I'm not there. I'm not dealing with the daily politics, but I do understand my role, and I know that it is to question the politics wherever I may be and to hold them accountable. By the way, under the previous administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who had a very different politic regarding immigration, which is the issue that I was mostly dealing with, it was under his administration that for the first time ever, my U.S. passport was taken from me at the Mexico City airport. And I was sent to that little room and almost had, no, I did have a panic attack. Thankfully, my daughter was with me and I was able to get my passport back, my U.S. passport back. But the reality now is that my reporting in terms of Mexico and what's happening in Mexico is changing. And in terms of the election between Claudia and Xochitl, I was one of the very few, if not the only one, I haven't been able to prove that 100%, maybe Alfredo knows, that was able to get an interview with both candidates, Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez. And, well, the truth is that Xochitl did give us an hour. But the truth is she also showed her hand. Xochitl arrived at our interview in New York City in Midtown that was starting at 7 p.m., which is not a usual time for an interview. She sat down for a full hour. But when she arrived in the studio, she arrived with an entourage of men. And the only woman who was there was carrying her clothes. So when you are running a campaign, are you running a campaign that says it's about feminism or that is actually about feminism? And actually all of Claudia Sheinbaum's main people who we were negotiating with and battling to get an interview were all women. By the way, I'm still battling to get another interview. She has said no. I don't know if there's any pull in this room, but if not, I'll just go to La Mañanera, because part of what's happening for me is that I am in the process of reclaiming my Mexican citizenship. That is central to me. It's like Gabriela, when I became an American citizen, for safety reasons, because I was like, this green card is not going to protect me forever in the year 1989. So a little forward thinking. Now I have to retrieve my Mexican citizenship, and it has been a whole process. And so as I was writing this, I was like, well, you talk a lot about asking your dad, who's passed away, about going back. By the way, my dad lived, his research lived because of NIH grants. So he would be heartbroken today, and we probably would have had to have packed up and moved back to Mexico if he was living today. And there would be no cochlear implant for my students to have. But why am I not asking my mom? My mom is alive. She just turned 89. My mom lives part of the year in Chicago, where she swims in Lake Michigan for a mile. She's one of those people on the South Side who does that. And mom lives half the year in Mexico, outside of Tepoztlan. And I know that my mom has essentially made the decision, yeah, the dream can exist here. And for my mom, the decision to plant her roots again in Mexico, to make her life there for her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, this is a dream come true. It is the Mexican dream. So what has, and again, I'm couching this, I do not want to be a sycophant or a Pollyanna in terms of the government of Mexico right now. And I'm not an expert on Mexican politics. But if you understand that one of the things you need to do as a country is to deal with your past and to deal with the thing that is most divisive in your country, and you try to deal with that, what would happen? My understanding is that this is what Claudia Sheinbaum is trying to do, right? They are taking on, they are transforming the central issues, right? Which, for example, what I grew up seeing, two key issues: poverty. Ay, mami, ¿por qué hay tanta pobreza en México? ¿Por qué hay tanta pobreza? Right? I remember as a little kid always asking. And the issue of indigeneity. The issue of gender and feminism, obviously, Claudia Sheinbaum, a woman president. But these two issues, the poor, the working poor, the hatred of the working poor and the poor. My family, members of my family who would talk about the poor in ways that would horrify me, right? So, straight up, we have our own work to do in Mexico. And also the anti-indigeneity of my own cousins who would make fun of me because I loved going to Oaxaca and to all the pyramids and getting all my camisas and my huipiles and my huaraches, and I would wear this, and all my cousins would be like, "Te ves ridícula." And I'd be like, "Why?" And they're like, "What are you doing dressing like that?" So this is what the Sheinbaum government is attempting to deal with. And when you take on these great fissures, the great divisions, things can happen. And when people said, oh, you know, my cousins who were like, Claudia is just going to be like AMLO, the next etapa, and I'm just like, not so fast, right? Not so fast. Because AMLO actually had a very problematic relationship to the issue of immigration. And it was my greatest critique, right? And I didn't actually have to critique. I was just reporting, showing what was happening, right? Showing how Mexico had learned from the United States, like, yeah, let's do our own border patrol. We'll call it Guardia Nacional. Yeah, and let's do our own detention facilities, but we're just going to call them places where we damos hospedaje, you know, where we let people stay. You know, it's not a detention facility. And obviously, again, and performative politics are problematic. But as I said to Kamala Harris when I did interview her as a candidate, I was like, you know what, at this point, I'll take some performative politics from the Democrats. Like, give me some performative politics. No. But some of you have seen how people who have been deported now with a process, who are being sent back to Mexico, and how they're being welcomed. Have you seen these? Okay. So for those of you who haven't seen them, I mean, they're, again, performative. I don't know it's happening everywhere, but for the sake of, we're going to indulge in performative politics for a moment here. Welcoming them back with bands, banda, and music, and social service agents who are taking information, being driven back to their towns and homes, being driven back, being taken back. When could you have imagined that this would be happening? And what Claudia is doing right there is she is demystifying that whole narrative of they're criminals, because she's like, criminals? Oh my God, we are winning in Mexico Thank you for giving us all of your highly educated bilingual workers. Yes, we got this. And making the play for the development of Mexico using that labor. Por Dios. It's like the stupidest thing you can do is what's happening now, right? Is deporting people that you have actually invested in and then sending them off to other countries. So it's all a matter of the storytelling and how we couch these things. And I'm that lucky journalist who is able to be in places because I insert myself. So being in a caravan that left Tapachula, by the way, if you've never been to Tapachula, which is on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, all the way at the southern part of Mexico, it's such an incredible city. It's the closest thing to New York City in Mexico that you'll ever get because people from all over the world are there. African, Haitian, Central America, Russian, from all parts, Bangladeshi, and now they're Mexican, right? Now they're just, many of them are choosing to stay. But the caravan, that thing that we hear about as being such a threat, is actually the most brilliant decision that you can make if you're a migrant or refugee, is to be a part of the caravan. And you know, they talk about it as being a caravan of fear and danger. It's a caravan of love, actually. It's a caravan of the smartest people making the smartest strategic decisions about how can I be the safest while making this journey in a caravan. Otherwise, I'm picked off by the bad operators that exist throughout Mexico, who, especially if you're black, you are a target. The caravan, what I like to describe to people is like, imagine 1,500 people who have been up since 4 in the morning and they are walking, not in the Cambridge or Boston pace of walking, excuse me. They're walking starting at 5 in the morning when the sun is up. They're walking like this for 8 hours, 10 hours. Now imagine 1,500 people walking like that for 8 to 10 hours, and they all arrive into Times Square. And then you know what they do? They go to sleep. They go to sleep. They lay down on the cement, on the sidewalks, and they go to sleep. What threat? What threat? They're brilliant, right? Or the people who I met when I was in El Darién, that place where I was like the most afraid, you know, and I was like, so I have to go there. Because the places that scare me are the places where I have to go. And so going to Darién, taking my daughter to document the trip, because it was during the middle of the pandemic, and she's a filmmaker. So exposing my daughter to what is the most dangerous place, sleeping in the middle of nowhere with dangerous people. And I felt no fear. And the people who got up at 4 in the morning in the Darién, after, I mean, it takes hours just to get to the Darién, to the place where you then go into the jungle. Those people who are like, climb the wettest rainforest jungle with my child? Sure, I can do that. Óyeme, talk about self-love. You know how obsessed we are with self-love in this country? They are filled with self-love. We should be welcoming them. We should be welcoming them because of what they bring to all of us. So that's our work, right? Is to demystify the lies. Tell the truth about who we are as Latinos and Latinas, right? We know that we are, the 5th largest? If we were rated by the gross domestic product, we'd be in the top 10, maybe number 7 of, trillions of dollars of economic power that Latinos and Latinas have, right? That we know that we are not committing more crime in our communities. Less crime. Use the data. Use the data. And that is exactly what Claudia Sheinbaum is doing. Attempting to change the narrative, not by just talking about it, by actually doing. Again, not perfect situation, but in terms of changing the narrative, it is possible. All right, I have got 5 minutes left, so how do I do this? Maybe we can talk, Gabriela, about the reporting that I just did, so I can talk about it then. You know, being here with all of you is part of my inspiration, right? It's what I take back with me so that every day I can wake up. By the way, if you follow me on social media, you will know that I am now, I think, on 2004, day number 2004 of meditation every single day. And I also was like, I'll never meditate. So don't say never. Don't say never about our democracy. Don't say never about this country. Don't say never about your own personal goals. But you do have to find what is that thing that you hold on to that motivates you to get to the next level. And for me, when I understood that yes, my inspiration of being a journalist came from my Mexican colleagues, Blanche and Guadalupe, and now Penile Ramirez, who is my co-CEO at the company at Futuro Media. But when I understood that I was part of a long tradition of journalists of conscience in the United States, that changed everything for me. So when I feel depleted, I think about my godfather of American journalism, Frederick Douglass. I think about my godmother of American journalism, Jovita Idar. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, look her up or ask me more. Jovita now is having a resurgence, but I didn't know of her. She's tiny like me in El Paso, and she had her own newspaper, and the Texas Rangers came to shut her down, and she defended it just like this with her own little body. They came back the next day and tore it down, but she wasn't there. But Jovita, investigative journalist at the turn of the century, Ruben Salazar, and Ida B. Wells. These are the journalists of conscience that motivate me, and that's why I know I cannot give up, right? What comes next? What does it look like? I don't know. None of us know. You know, the vulnerability that we're all feeling, that's why you have to find the thing that works for you. For me, you know it if you follow me. Meditation, working out like a crazy person, boxing, nature, birds. I'm a big birder. And my family, and creating community. And ultimately, these are things that really were born for me in las raíces de Mexico, right? That I carry with me now. And I'll always be very thankful to have left Chicago, the city where I grew up, which was a very Mexican city, ended up in New York in '79. It was not a very Mexican city. And, you know, there were no tortillas. I still fly in my tortillas from Chicago, by the way. But that experience of being in New York at that time, in the 80s, was when I realized that I am not just Mexicana, orgullosamente Mexicana, but I am Latin American, that I have a continent behind me, orgullosamente Norteamericana as well, and I will fight for this country too. Because this fight for democracy and representation and truth and honesty and independence and feminism, and that isn't something that you just do for a little bit. It's your whole life. You need to wrap your heads around that. It's your whole life. So when you are feeling vulnerable or weak, surround yourself with people who can protect you, and also find the strength that you have in your own self. Because none of you would be here if you didn't have that grit and those ganas. Muchas gracias, Gabriela. Thank you so much.
So we're going to do about 15 minutes of a Q&A with Maria, and before we go on to a moment, I know you've pointed to a couple of questions, but I wanted to just signal how one of the key points in your talk was about shifting the narrative, simply by even shifting the byline, shifting the headline, and how that shifts not just the narrative, but it shifts the parameters of ignorance and of fear. So thank you there were so many takeaways, but that one in particular. You also said that we deport our problems. We are a country here in the United States that deports. It's part of our history. It's part of who we are. We deport our problems, to quote you there. So I wanted to ask you to start the first question talking about deportation. What does deportation mean for the United States, this current deportation that's happening, but also what does deportation mean for the receiving countries?
You know, I think the deportation for the receiving countries, it's actually unfolding as we speak, right? I mean, who would have thought that you would see a plane full of Venezuelans being deported or removed who are applauding when the plane lands in Caracas? Right? And so now you have a situation that we can't even begin to, it's like, so these people left because of the regime in Venezuela, but now they're coming back and they're being welcomed by that same government. So how are they going to process this? It could potentially change everything in terms of the internal politics of Venezuela. How? I don't know. But it's absolutely going to shift the politics of Venezuela. In terms of Mexico, I've already said how this is potentially a great boon. I mean, you know, population growth in Mexico is flat right now. So Mexicans need immigrants, which is why Claudia's changing of the narrative works, because it shouldn't just be the people who are being deported who end up back in Mexico, or the people making that trek. Pero México puede recibir gente de donde quiera, from wherever, as a possibility. So that too is being changed as we speak. For the United States, you know, the wounds go so deep. Families are going to be ripped apart. We've already had a child take her own life because of the threat of her parents being deported. We will lose children for sure because of mental health crises that they're going to experience. We will lose people for sure, whether they die in the immigrant detention camps or as some part of the process, or, you know, when people were being deported like maybe 12 years ago, and I went back to Mexico to report that story, there was a tremendous amount of depression among the Mexicans who were being deported. And so that was something that, and they were also taking their own lives in that situation. But for the United States, you know, will there be a direct economic impact? I'm not so sure. And the reason why is because the movement of labor from the south into the north doesn't just happen like willy-nilly. How do immigrants and refugees end up in Mississippi, for example, which we've been reporting about since 2017? It's because you have labor recruiters that are sent out and hired by the poultry processing plants to go and recruit the labor that is then brought in. Remember we talked about corruption on the border? I mean, how do you think they're coming in? Because they're a corrupt border patrol that know exactly what's happening. That's one of the reasons. Also because the wall has holes all over it, which is ridiculous and silly. So the story that I would have done in Guatemala if I had time was actually to find the labor recruiters that are already on the ground in the poorest parts of Guatemala, for example, and that are already starting to take names for when they will need to start bringing people in to do the work in the farms or in the poultry plants or in the meat processing plants. So the labor supply will continue to exist, and that's why I'm not so sure that the American consumer is going to be able to say, oh, I'm feeling it. But the trauma in our communities, that's real. Then again, we've already been through this before. Remember, deportations have been happening intensely since George W. Bush shifted his love of immigrants to instead his love of private prisons. That's really where it shifts in his second term. But is it a loss for our country? It's a profound wound. And I'm already imagining, when will the apologies be made to the people? When will the apologies and the legal consequences? That's hard to say. But this country will have to atone for what it has done, for sure.
Thank you for that really powerful response. I'm touching just on a couple of points that you made in your talk. One of them was when you talk about Sheinbaum, I wanted to ask you, why was this Sheinbaum's moment and not Kamala Harris's moment?
I would say, from my humble opinion, and it's Sheinbaum. It's not Sheinbaum. Sorry to correct you.
Maria, you can always correct me.
But we're friends like that. I just don't ever want you to be seen como que Gabriela no sabe. No, it's Sheinbaum. How can I say this in a respectful way? Porque Claudia se puso los pantalones. Okay? And she took, I'm assuming, right, because I wasn't in the internal part of her campaign, or in the upper leadership of her administration now. But it's what we all could see. And by the way, Kamala Harris was dealt a bad card, for sure, by the Democratic Party that should have named her earlier and prepared her, et cetera. But in our country, she's listening to that group of men that accompanied Xochitl. All those male advisors, she was listening to them. Instead of ponerse los pantalones and say, I'm a woman of a certain generation and you can't tell me what to do, which is where I'm at in my life. Yeah, also winning the Pulitzer is great. I'm like, okay, come on, let's go. What? You want to, come on, let's go. Because I want a Pulitzer that I never in my life, I don't like to throw it around, but when I have to, oh, you can bet. So that's why I was talking about this particular generation of Mexican woman who has lived through these particular political dynamics and who are now at a point in their lives where they're like, es que I do what I want to do. And by the way, not being a jerk, I'm a big proponent about not being a jerk in things, right? But being able to say, es que va a ser así. Because AMLO did not change the narrative on immigrants. He did not. He was part of the problem and responsible for many of those attacks that happened against innocent migrants and refugees and travelers in Mexico. He did not. Claudia has changed it. And because se puso los pantalones. Such a gender-based reference.
So I'm getting the signal that we need to move it on. So I just.
But why? Having so much fun.
I had other questions, but I really want to go to the Guatemala trip that you recently talked about because I know little of what was happening there, but you said it was very intense.
Yeah. So
if we could talk a little bit about the reporting.
Yes.
What you can say about that trip.
Right. So in Guatemala, I was on a fact-finding mission, and we were there to bear witness to the parts of the Guatemalan society that are not quiet about what happened, about the fact that there was a genocide, about the fact that currently today, you have 45,000 people who remain disappeared. 45,000. So you get to a situation where you're talking with people who say, well, my family was killed in a military massacre on such and such a date in such and such a place, but I found their body and I know how they died. For the 45,000 disappeared, there's never that answer, right? And I had a cousin who was disappeared in Mexico también. It was horrible. You just never know. So what they have done is they have built a museum of the memory, and they have not given up. And so we went to a place that was a former military base where they uncovered what we saw, 3 mass graves. And for indigenous people, the earth, the Mother Earth, is such, she's everything, right? and these mass graves that they have left open to bear witness to where the people were buried, like an open wound. And they will not be quiet. And so that is, the horror is what they live through, and the fact that it's a politics of negation. The other side of it, which we have to take inspiration from, is that the activists remain committed and not silent, right? In Guatemala, right? And then I was in El Salvador doing a story that, so for those of you who are journalists, you never know where your next big story is going to come from. And this one happened to come from Carmen, who works with me. She cleans my house every week, and we are very good friends. She's been in the States for a decade, and she's from El Salvador. And a couple of months ago, she said, no, pues no va a creer, señora María. They're putting women in prison in El Salvador for having a miscarriage. And I was like, ¿Cómo, Carmen? No. See? They're putting women in, because we know about the prison culture now in El Salvador. We see the dehumanization of the men. But then women in prison for a miscarriage? And I was like, okay, let me take note of that. And immediately, my last communication with Cecile Richards, who was the former head of Planned Parenthood's daughter of former Texas Governor Ann Richards, I texted her and I was like, is this true? Are women being put into prison in El Salvador because of miscarriage? And she said, yes, here's your source. And so we went to El Salvador and we are reporting on this reality. In El Salvador, if you have a miscarriage, it's not called what we call it in Mexico and in Latin America, which is una pérdida. It's a loss, it's a miscarriage. They call it aborto espontáneo. Abortion is illegal. So if you, it's crazy. And I was with women who served over a decade for having a stillborn or for having a miscarriage. So that's going to be our next big investigative piece that's coming out in several months. But yeah, so the horrors, but then I meet the women who have come out and who have built a house for returning women, where they get together and they cook and they learn skills and they work out and they play basketball and they have a theater group, and the theater group is now traveling to visit other prisons in Latin America. So like the hope, which is what I hope I leave with you, right? That we just cannot give up hope, ever.
So I want to end on a note of hope, but I also do really want to ask you this question. And I saw Julian pointing at the watch, but Julian, hold on.
Well, what are they going to do, throw us out?
From your perspective as a journalist, what is the biggest threat to democracy now? But also from your perspective as an academic, as a professor, what is the greatest threat to democracy? But also from your perspective as an entrepreneur, what is the greatest threat to our democracy right now?
I mean, the threats to our democracy right now are so many and so varied. Our need to protect our legal rights in this country and our lawyers, right, who can argue. The fact that lawyers and the legal system could be targeted next. That is just another tipping point. But threats to democracy, you just live through it. Just a few minutes from here is what's happening. I mean, it's registering for you, but it's like they are plainclothes officers without identification, without nameplates, and putting people into unmarked cars without Miranda rights. If Gabriela and I ever intersect with the immigration legal system, we have no due process. Miranda, that is read to you if you are being charged criminally. All of the people, it drives me crazy that people are saying arrested by immigration officials. You are not arrested. You are detained because they do not have the power to arrest. Arrest is a criminal act. What they are saying incorrectly is that simply by being here without documents is a criminal act. So right now my obsession is with judges and lawyers. You know, with this Supreme Court, how far will it go? We don't know. For me, as a professor, you know, I haven't been on campus because of break, but we're also living it. I mean, my students are traumatized, and I ask my Jewish students almost every week, how are you doing? And they're like, we were fine until the NYPD came on our campus. So we now have a dynamic where my students, and that was what, a month ago. So now it's like we have NYPD and ICE on our campus potentially. How can my students feel like I've given them a safe space to thrive as thinkers and students if they are worried that they could be next? And by the way, the revelation for me is like, I'm like, oh Maria, when you were in college, you had a green card. And you were organizing protests against the college. So that could have been me. That person taken could have been me. So again, the threats on our campuses, we are watching it as a slippery slope. At what point does Columbia University have to say to the administration, sure, you can come into our classes and monitor our classes. Sure, you can sit. Oh, you want to come in and not identify yourselves? Sure. It's all possible now. It's entirely possible now. And then as an entrepreneur, I mean, right now the reality is that I run an independent nonprofit journalism operation created by a Mexican immigrant woman with a show that its premiere show is Latino USA. I mean, it feels kind of like I'm on a bullseye. So for us, you know, we're also having to think as fast as possible. So how do we keep our journalism alive? How do we do the best kind of journalism? How do we, you know, interact with social media, make sure that we're still relevant, et cetera, and also prepare for what might come, right? Which we don't know. So on every level, the threats are very real, but at every level, Gabriela, I can tell you that I will not stop, and I won't be quiet, and I'm not going away, and I'm not going to disappear, and I'm not walking away from the great challenge of this historical moment, and I hope none of you do either.
And on that note of not stopping, not giving up, help me think again, Maria, on your perspective.
Oh, I get a bag.